debt in China that threatens to cripple the economy. Now, that's a pleasant topic compared to Russia and the United States, but you are an expert, of course, on debt and the problems that come from excessive debt. Kyle Bass has suggested that the situation with the explosion of leverage and debt in China since 2008 is setting up a situation that might force the Chinese to devalue the yuan in a massive way, potentially sending a wave of deflation around the world. And, of course, there's a lot of different views as to whether or not that's realistic. How do you see this? Is that a realistic scenario that Mr. Bass paints, or is he completely out to lunch?
No, I think it's actually pretty much on the money there, because the only thing that got China through the crisis back in 2008 was an incredible increase in private credit. If you look at the first impact of the global financial crisis on China, it was something like about a 40% fall in its exports volume very, very rapidly. And what that meant was that the factories, which are mainly along the coastal cities in China, were forced to lay people off. And when they laid them off, most of them didn't have work permits to actually be in those cities. They were forced back to the countryside. So the scale of political chaos that meant for China was enormous, and they had to get a rapid stimulus in there. Now, what they did was, because the state banks are pretty much actually government-owned banks, and also because in China, if an official tells you to do something, it's very good for your health to follow the instructions. So the level of credit in China as a percentage of GDP was about 20% when the crisis began. It fell, as it would have done because of the lack of demand for investment in that stage, towards 15%, and then the directive hit, and it went from 15% of GDP to 38% of GDP in 1 year. That was the increase in credit. Now, it's fallen back from that peak, but it's still, after peaking at almost 40% of GDP in 2010, it has never fallen below 20% of GDP, and it's now bouncing between 28 and 30% of GDP. That's given China, its debt level's gone from about 100% to 200% in just about 8 years, an enormous scale, one of the probably the biggest bubble in financial history in terms of the volume of money we're talking about here. Now that's reaching, it's gone, I think, well past capacity. There are lots of loss-making ventures in China now, courtesy of that enormous level of leverage. And it has to end. You won't see China going much beyond reported level of, say, 225% of GDP as its private debt level. It's currently about 210. And when that happens, the credit-based demand disappears, and we're talking about demand equivalent to roughly 1/4 of the size of the world's second largest economy. Now, that's huge. That's like $2.5 trillion of demand will disappear from the global economy as that decline in credit starts. And can the Chinese government counteract that with its own spending? Now, it's far more likely to move into that than any Western democratic nation, because they just simply don't face the legislative and parliamentary limits on their behaviour, and it's always been a centrally directed system. So to go back to government spending being the driving force is, like returning to mama. So I can see them doing it, but they can't avoid a credit crunch in the meantime. Now that means that in the next 1 or 2 years, you're likely to see a serious decline in China, comparable to what happened at the time of the global financial crisis itself, and then attempts to reverse it. And in that situation, the currency going down and the government actually trying to assist that along its way by selling its own currency, which it has enormous capacity to do, then you could see that deflationary shock come through the rest of the global economy starting around, say, 2020.
So it sounds like a credit